In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Rukia takes on her most fearsome enemy yet. Ichigo begins his return from the royal palace, and a strange new foe corners Isane and Yachiru. Episode 19 of the 1,000-Year Blood War, titled The White Haze, is the first episode of the new core that I've been really looking forward to. Of course, I've been excited for each and every episode in their own way every week, but this is the first one to adapt a fight that I was personally really anticipating with bated breath. Arguably starting with Renji vs Masked Masculine last week and reaching its apex with Kenpachi vs Gremmy still to come, Rukia vs Äs Nödt continues a trilogy of major battles that help to round out this first half of the second Quincy invasion. One reason I think these particular fights are held in such high regard by the community is that they remind us of the Bleach fights of old, an isolated 1v1 duel to the death that spanned a solid chunk of chapters in a row. For a time, the spotlight is placed squarely on one fight, and I've always loved that. There's a lot going on in this arc at almost all times, so when Kubo was able to dedicate that space to an individual fight, you knew it was a big deal. Now, I've been looking forward to Rukia vs Äs Nödt for a number of reasons. This fight promised to be visually spectacular, featuring the one and only appearance of Rukia's stunning, ice-cold Bankai, and contrasting that storybook, almost fairy tale beauty with the twisted, contorted madness of Äs Nödt's fear and his absolutely fantastic design. Not only that, but here, Rukia's developmental arc is capped off in a fashion she always deserved, and as a reader and a viewer, that's extremely cathartic. So it was always going to be good, and the anime had the chance to truly bring the battle to life in a way it simply hadn't been before. The question is, did it succeed? Let's dive into our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, episode 19, The White Haze. As always, I'll be looking at the episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and of course what it took away from the source material. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, when you're done with it, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to give a massive shout out and say an enormous, everlasting thank you to everyone supporting me there over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Okay, so as we always do, we need to kick the review off by taking a look at what the episode covered this week, and once again, there's a lot going on here. Now, again, the majority of the episode is adapting a fight, so it's not too egregious. Though, speaking of that, I've heard some crazy things about next week's upcoming episode and its chapter count, but we'll leave that discussion for now. In the meantime, these are the chapters covered in episode 19. First of all, there's chapter 555, The Hero, a scene from chapter 559, The Night Right, a very small portion of chapter 565, God Like You, chapter 566, What Is Your Fear, chapter 567, Dance with Snow White, chapter 568, Here Fear Here Too, chapter 569, The White Haze, which is of course this episode's title, and finally chapter 570, Closer, Closer. I mean, just looking at that list, this is definitely one of, if not the most packed episode to date, at least in terms of chapter content included. But like I said, with the bulk of those chapters focusing exclusively on Rukia vs Äs Nödt, the pacing on the whole actually felt pretty good this week, I think. It's funny though, that sweet spot of 4 chapters that we used to talk about in the first core feels like it has been long left far behind at this rate. To be honest, I don't foresee when, if ever, in this core at least, we'll return to that kind of coverage again. But enough about that, on to the episode analysis itself. Before we get to Rukia vs Äs Nödt, however, we've got a few other scenes to talk about. The episode opens with a long overdue adaptation of chapter 555, a small portion of which was included back in episode 17. However, this is now the bulk of that chapter, featuring Ichigo finishing up his training in the royal palace. Of course, despite this scene looking mostly the same as it does in the source material, it comes with considerably more baggage here in the anime, as now we've been privy to Ichigo's divine training with Ichibei, which is great and adds real weight to this moment. When Ichigo leaves to help the Soul Society here, there's a genuine, palpable sense that he is bringing so much more with him this time. The scene opens in the same way as the chapter, with Ichigo arriving on the Royal Palace walkway in his new Oken clothing. I've always loved this outfit, and I wish we saw a little bit more of it, but the details are captured perfectly here in the episode. I will say quickly that it's a shame that Senjumaru's contribution has been glossed over once again. In the source material, we saw a brief flashback of Renji to his meeting with the seamstress, but even that was totally cut here in the anime. In its place, we had a small moment of Ichigo arriving in her palace, but alas, that's all we're getting out of her for now. Like I mentioned in my live reaction though, I think it's just a case of us not really needing to see her making their outfits, though I do wonder when we'll get both her and Ichibei's splash screens, since they're still missing and are now both overdue. Anyway, the continuation of this scene is slightly altered between the source and the anime. In the anime, Ichigo approaches the Zero Division with a funny new line where he comments about wearing too many layers. However, this leads to Senjumaru explaining why he needs those clothes in the first place, that he'll need them to punch a hole in the 72-layer barrier separating the palace and the Seirete. This is actually information we receive later on anyway from Yūhabuk, so I wonder if him relaying that to Ichigo will be cut in the future. I actually like it coming from Senjumaru more, I think, as of course the clothes are her work. In the chapter, there's a light-hearted scene where Ichigo wonders where the Tenchuren is that he arrived on. Senjumaru then summons the heavenly staircase that will take Ichigo back to the Seirete. I like how the staircase looks in the anime. Seeing the stairs themselves unfold like that is a really cool visual, and I especially like the distance shot we get of it later on that really sells the scope of just how high up the palace really is. As Tenjiro tells Ichigo that it should only take him about a week to get back to the Seirete using Shunpo, the anime removes Tenjiro's expectation that Ichigo is going to throw a childish tantrum about the amount of time it'll take. Honestly, I think this is a good change. I appreciate what Kubo was trying to portray in this moment, having Tenjiro expect Ichigo to snap at him only to be shocked when he doesn't, shows just how much Ichigo has matured, even in the short time he's spent in the palace, but I always thought it felt very heavy-handed to me, and I prefer the more natural depiction we get in the anime. Now, just as in the source material, Ichibei arrives to tell Ichigo that the Quincy's began their attack 3 hours ago, causing Ichigo to leave in a hurry, blasting down towards the Seirete at breakneck speed. Interestingly, Hikifune is present in this scene from the beginning in the anime, but in the chapter she's late, and she runs to catch Ichigo before he leaves. Again, I think I actually prefer the anime's version. In the source material, Kubo giving this moment some additional prominence led people to think that the rice balls Hikifune throws to Ichigo might have some unknown significance, but they're never mentioned again, so it's likely he really does just eat them on the journey down. That being said, since Hikifune is now here from the beginning this time, she probably could have just given them to Ichigo before he took off. As Ichigo leaves, the Zero Division ponder how much he's changed. Ichibei's parting comment has been altered in a way that is very interesting. In the original chapter, he has a brief comedic moment with the others where he reiterates that Ichigo has become stronger, before capping it off by saying he has become a true Shinigami at last. Now, back in the day, this was obviously just reaffirming the simple truth that Ichigo now has his true Zanpakuto thanks to the revelations of everything but the rain and his time in Oetsu's forge. Yet Ichibei's comment is different here in the anime. In the episode, Ichibei says that Ichigo has become a true Shinigami, one who has surpassed the ordinary Shinigami. Now that's a little strange. Is Ichibei implying a true Shinigami is one who has surpassed an ordinary one? If so, what's the difference then between a true Shinigami and an ordinary one? Or is he simply saying that Ichigo is now a true Shinigami, but one who has surpassed the rest? Of course, either way, this new comment about Ichigo surpassing an ordinary Shinigami harks back to the previously unseen training on Irazu Sandor that we've now witnessed. Whatever Ichibei has done to Ichigo, seemingly in relation to the Soul King himself, has had some material effect that we've yet to see. The shot of Ichigo flying down the stairs looks really fantastic and is again from the very first teaser trailer for Core 2 we received. As Ichigo swoops down from the heavens, we return very briefly to the end of chapter 554, so briefly that it didn't really even warrant inclusion in the list of chapters covered, as Kisuke and Mayuri debate what moves to make next when Ichigo suddenly calls Kisuke. Ichigo's conversation with Kisuke is the same as the source material, though it's a bit of a shame they removed Kisuke's small smile when Ichigo promises him he'll take care of the situation for them. It's a light but surprisingly human moment for Kisuke, a moment of acknowledgement where you can see his relief that Ichigo is the same person he ever was, even after being subjected to the royal palace. However, Ichigo decides to hurry up and rockets towards Earth, blasting through the clouds and the stairs on his way to the battle. In my opinion, this is a really effective manner with which to open the episode. It's cool, of course, to know that Ichigo is finally on his way now. It's interesting. If Ichigo arrives at the same point he does in the source material, which we can assume he probably will, then it will have technically taken him far less time to reach the Seirete than it did in the source material. By this point in the original chapters, we still had Komamura and Renji's battles to go too. The next scene is a really fascinating one. While in a sense we're continuing with chapter 565, Godlike You, as suspected last week it's actually being combined with chapter 559, The Night Right, as Hashwolf leads Uryu to where Kangdu and BG9 are being held. Immediately, there are new details about this scene that I love. The entrance to the hall is lined with Quincy foot soldiers, giving the entire process a much more official feel to it rather than it just being some dodgy back alley execution. Secondly, the hall is named here in the anime as Ritter Second Spire Execution Ground, which is awesome. Of course, Yhwach isn't present at the execution like he is in the source material. Instead, Uryu takes his place, a change that I think is a net positive that we'll discuss in a moment. The lighting and the scene setting is incredible in this sequence. The moody, atmospheric low light of the blue flames on the wall is maybe some of my favourite lighting in the anime to date. Everything just looks so crisp. Hashwolf approaches Kangdu first without a word, rests his blade on his neck, and prepares to kill him with a single strike. As Hashwolf brings his sword downwards, he's met, however, with a loud, dull thud. Kang has blocked his strike with the iron. Before we carry on, let's get what I don't like about this scene out of the way first. It's a shame they completely removed all of Kang and BG9's dialogue from this moment, as it provided Kang especially with a really badass last stand. In the original chapter, BG9 pleads with Yhwach to spare them as they're still capable of fighting for him, while Kangdu simply hangs his head. When Yhwach says that they survived thanks to their good fortune, Hashwolf says that the scales of battle must be fair, and that lives saved by good fortune must be swept away by equal amounts of ill fortune before attacking Kang. However, in the original chapter, when Kang blocks Hashwolf's attack, he snarkily reminds him of the power of his Schrift, before angrily telling him that he won't allow anyone to kill him but Yhwach. Now, there's an important distinction to be made here, I think. In the original chapter, Kangdu comes across as a true zealot. It's not that he disagrees with his punishment per se, perhaps he even thinks he's deserving of death. But as far as he's concerned, only His Majesty is allowed to kill him, not even his second-in-command. In the anime, with all of Kangdu's dialogue stripped out, this just looks like defiance for the sake of defiance, like he simply doesn't want to die. Anyway, it's a small point because while I wish they left that dialogue in, everything else about this scene is superior here in the anime. Everything about this moment just simply makes more sense here than it did in the original chapter. Firstly, the execution in chapter 559 happens in a total vacuum. It comes out of nowhere and doesn't seem to have any point or reason to it until a little bit later on when we finally learn about Yhwach's nature. Here, though, the execution is built up too nicely, with Uryu collecting both Sternritter a few episodes ago. Yhwach not being here as well is a nice touch. After all, why does he care what happens to a few Sternritter? Plus, Uryu gets to witness firsthand how serious these guys actually are, and we see him quickly out of his depth. And secondly, when Hashwolf's attack is blocked by Kang's Schrift, he tells him that you were fortunate to block the Blade of Judgment. However, the life that was spared by your good fortune will be removed with the same amount of misfortune. And this is overall just much better dialogue than what was in the chapter, where Hashwolf mentioned making the scales of battle fair, which at the time seemed ridiculous. You're killing off 2 perfectly good Sternritter to make the war fairer? Here, there is no misconception about why he is killing them. They are being judged, and their power is going straight back to Yhwach, and I really appreciate the clarity here. We get the same very cool and ominous imagery of the massive scale tipping behind Hashwolf as he activates his Schrift, and Kang looks on in horror. It's an interesting moment too, both here and in the source material. Can Hashwolf actually manifest a gigantic scale? Can anyone see it, or just the person he's confronting at the time? The brutality of this scene is also absolutely second to none in the anime so far, and I was genuinely surprised on my first watch. Hashwolf decapitates Kang, but not only that, we actually see his headless corpse still spurting blood beside BG9, which is a new level of dark even for the 1000-Year Blood War anime. Not only would the original anime have never shown this, but I imagine Kang would have probably just been slashed by Hashwolf across the chest and killed that way instead. But in my opinion, the gore really helps to elevate how cruel and sinister this scene actually is, making it appear like something out of a horror show, especially as Uryu looks on in terror, almost acting as a surrogate for the audience. What has he gotten himself into here? In the chapter, this is where the scene ends, with Kang's body being split apart by Hashwolf's blade. Here, however, the execution continues, and we actually witness BG9's fate too. His head is removed as well, gallons of what appear to be jet black oil gushing from his body. BG9's head lands on the floor by Hashwolf's feet, and his light fizzles out for good. I'm not going to spend too much time on this point, but once again, it is completely absurd and honestly inexcusable that we don't find out BG9's Schrift. I mean, it feels like there's no other word for it than a real oversight to me. BG9 isn't an important character, don't get me wrong, but it's the principle of the matter that makes it so irritating. We know every other Sternritter's Schrift bar Robert Akutrone's N. The Sternritter are already fairly thinly developed characters as it is, but aside from their names, their Schrift is the most baseline expectation of development we had for them as characters. It was absolutely feasible back in the day that Kubo simply forgot to add in 2 of them during the series' original run, but that means then that they should have been here. It's a tiny piece of information that fans would have liked to have had, if only to complete the puzzle that is Sternritter Schrifts, and in an anime that arrives long after the fact, you would think they would have taken a holistic view of the arc and filled in the gaps. I guess it's possible we might still get it in the future, but for now it doesn't look likely. It's also ridiculous, to the point of a joke, that Hashwolf actually announces Kang's the Iron, and yet there is no acknowledgement of BG9's powers. That does feel like a bad joke. Admittedly, I do think BG9's Schrift is fairly obvious when it's all said and done. It's either the knowledge or the knowing, and as I mentioned, Äs Nödt's Schrift was also never officially revealed in the actual chapters themselves too, but at least he got a small sketch unveiling it, plus his was even more obvious than BG9's. Of them all, Robert's is definitely the most nebulous, and it'll be even more disappointing if we don't learn what his is. It's just kind of funny to think that characters who appeared in the source material dead, so I'm talking about Jerome, Berenice, Lloyd, we technically know more about what they can do on an official capacity than we do BG9 and Robert. Anyway, moving on, I'm able to appreciate all of this much better here in the anime. It makes a lot more sense why these two were picked up. The order was to annihilate the enemy instantly, but they messed around and paid the price for it. Kangdu swooped in, preventing Bazby from killing Hitsugaya, and then lost after waxing lyrical to him for ages about the beauty of his Bankai. Meanwhile, BG9 fared a little better, but he still tried to probe Soifon for data rather than actually kill her. I've always loved both of these villains' designs, but there's no denying that in the eyes of their empire, they're both failures. As the scene continues, we see a truly eerie shot of both Kang and BG9's headless bodies, their souls and Quincy Reryoku escaping them in pillars of blue light. As this happens, Hashwolf explains that all those who are given parts of Yhwach's soul will have their powers absorbed by His Majesty upon death. There's a fantastic shot of Hashwolf's eye gleaming a crystalline blue as he gazes at the light, followed by Yhwach himself taking back their power, closing his fist around the energy. This is just so much better than in the original chapter. Rather than them being killed for, like I said, what felt like a totally arbitrary reason, Hashwolf explains to Uryu what's going on, why they died, and what happens to their power. One thing is a little weird though. I thought Yhwach was supposed to be asleep right now, so how is he able to reach out and grab their energy like that? Anyway, obviously here, Hashwolf is pondering his own eventual fate too, how he seems to be doomed, how he is trapped, almost enslaved into servitude to Yhwach, and what will happen to his soul when he inevitably dies. But after that, we see the headless bodies of Kang and BG9 carted away by Soldat, Kang's mouth still wide open agape in horror. Again, this is amazingly bleak and evokes images of medieval Europe during the bubonic plague or something. I honestly love it. It reinforces the occult, Templar-like imagery of these villains. We get more new dialogue here as well, as Uryu, continuing to act as the avatar for the audience, questions the decision to kill them as they were powerful assets. However, Hashwolf says Yhwach's goal isn't the Soul Society at all. Hashwolf instead says that it's up to His Majesty to decide what is and what isn't needed to achieve his true goal. Of course, this is foreshadowing Yhwach eventually using the Auschweilen on all Sternritter deemed unnecessary for the acquisition of his true goal, being conquering the royal palace. Some dialogue from God Like You is now threaded back in here, with Hashwolf telling Uryu he's already had a Schrift engraved in his soul too and can no longer escape his fate. It is again a bit of a shame this conversation is totally trimmed down, removing the antagonistic element between these two characters. In the source material, Hashwolf is hugely suspicious of Uryu's motivations, even going so far as to directly confront and call him out, pinning him to the wall and telling him that if he joined them to avenge his mother's death, it's too late now to do anything about it. So the nature of their relationship does seem to have changed somewhat here, unless that scene is added later on perhaps. But the anime definitely seems to be trying to make Uryu appear more like a villain, which I do like, and I can't help but wonder if it's in aid of an eventual battle between himself and Ichigo. Finally, as we reach the end of the scene, Hashwolf tells Uryu that Yhwach must continue to absorb souls, or else. And then the anime hides what Hashwolf says next, only showing Uryu's shocked reaction. I'm a little surprised they've hidden what Hashwolf is saying here, unless it is different to what he says in the source material. If not, then Hashwolf is simply saying that Yhwach will regress to his previous crippled self from birth, which doesn't feel like a big enough revelation to obscure in my opinion, so I wonder if something else is going on here. Anyway, we're finally done with this sequence, so it's time to move on to the main event. The anime then moves to chapter 566, showing Rukia speeding across the Quincy terrain. As I predicted last week, Renji's scene from the start of this chapter has been cut completely, showing him waking up after having hidden in a building overnight. And again, in my opinion, it makes total sense to remove this. In the source material, Renji is being spied on by Sternritter Yu, Nananajacoup, who then threatens to take him down after having observed him for a very long time. Except nothing ever came of this moment, and it was never followed up on. so I'm not surprised to see it gone. Now, since we already saw Rukia finding Isane last week, that scene is gone from here, so we immediately find Rukia touching down on a building, considering meeting up with Renji again to attack the castle. The creepy visual of Äs Nödt's hand reaching up and touching Rukia's arm is included here to great effect, setting the tone for the battle to come in a really excellent way. But chapter 566, and really the majority of this entire fight, is adapted very faithfully, which is fantastic to see. After seeing how truncated Renji's battle against Mask was last week, I'm very pleased to see Rukia vs Äs Nödt is almost totally untouched. The fight really flourishes as a result, and is easily the best fight of the second core so far. In fact, it may be the best fight of the arc to date, not including the powerhouse showcase of Yamamoto vs Royd, of course. While the pacing is still definitely quick, some of the smaller moments are left intact here, which really adds to the overall battle. For example, Äs Nödt's introduction, where he walks slowly towards Rukia, muttering about how lonely he is as his feet leave these ghostly ripples on the ground beneath him, as though he's a wandering spirit or something. The anime's sound design is top-notch here too. Äs Nödt's voice coming in and out of focus is a brilliant touch for helping to convey that sense of delirious unease. The two's first interaction plays out identically to the source material. Rukia confirms that she knows who Äs Nödt is once he mentions Senbon Sakura, to which he replies that he knows her as well, removing his cloak. Äs Nödt wonders if Byakuya will arrive should he kill Rukia, to which Rukia comments he might do. Laughing creepily, Äs Nödt summons a ring of thorn arrows and the battle gets underway. I absolutely adore, by the way, Äs Nödt's sickly, croaky, coughing laugh. It's so very fitting for the character and adds another element to him that helps make him more dynamic. The animation is lovely and fluid as Rukia attempts to dodge the arrows, darting and flipping out of the way. The barrage of attacks slamming into the building behind her, leaving a sickly purple ooze in their wake, which Rukia suspects is Äs Nödt's fear ability. Although it's never confirmed, I always liked the implication that Renji took the time to tell Rukia about the man who nearly killed her brother, perhaps in case she sought him out. But Äs Nödt slings another wave of thorns at Rukia and she blocks them with Sode no Shirayuki, but the arrows continue to drill deeper into the ice, producing that fear ooze, which then seeps through the ice and latches onto Rukia. Honestly, I'm not sure how this works. In the original chapter, the arrow was much closer to Rukia and the fear oil just kind of exploded out of the ice and splashed her. Here, the liquid travels through the ice and climbs onto Rukia's blade in an almost parasitic venom-like fashion. It's a cool visual, but I wonder if Äs Nödt is capable of controlling it to that degree, or if he just happened to get lucky. The moment the fear touches Rukia's hand, however, she drops her sword and seemingly doubles over as if a cold sensation has gripped her. As we reach the end of chapter 566, I always found this scene kind of funny in a way, because presumably Rukia hasn't been affected by the fear at all, but she's acting like she has been for a bit of dramatic effect. Rukia lifts her head, wondering if fear not working is Äs Nödt's own fear. Like I mentioned in my live reaction, I never realised before this episode that Äs Nödt was bent over sideways like that because he was trying to look at Rukia's face from underneath when she was leaning forwards. I always thought he was just being really weird. Anyway, chapter 567 begins and Rukia's conversation with Äs is again almost identical to the source material as she challenges him to attack her once more. We get the animation of her brandishing her sword from the original teaser trailer too, which again is cool to see. Äs Nödt launches his arrows once more and one of them slams into Rukia's hand. Äs Nödt's line here mocking Rukia, saying her words are rich coming from someone who was running from his arrows a moment ago, is cut from the episode. However, Rukia reveals that she has frozen his thorn and crushes it with her hand, explaining how she had to wait a moment before being able to draw out her Zanpakuto's true power and couldn't afford to be hit before that. There's a really cool brand new shot of her with her fist outstretched that reminds me a little of when Byakuya defeated Tsukishima. In another example of this battle being given its due space, Äs Nödt then gets his entire fear monologue, which is surprisingly long. He explains that his fear just needs the slightest skin contact to be effective, and it can never be guarded against. We get some really cool, inventive imagery throughout his speech, including a close-up of Rukia's eye as several shadowy hands burst out of it before that crude black liquid then runs down her face and body, perhaps showing fear bubbling up inside of her and then completely taking hold. The visualization of Äs Nödt's power seemingly consuming and controlling Rukia is really excellent, and the anime does a lot with his eyes in particular to make him appear truly unsettling. As Sode no Shirayuki's power activates, however, gradually freezing Rukia's body, the new ice effect is really lovely, covering her in a misty, cold haze littered with glittering snowflakes. I do still reiterate that it's weird her Zanpakuto's ability completely changed in this arc essentially, when originally it was far closer to that of Hyorin Maru's, but I like that it's more unique now too. Rukia explains that it lowers her body temperature and everything the blade comes into contact with freezes, acting now as little more than an extension of her own arm. After explaining why the fear is no longer working, Rukia rushes the Sternritter, darting past him and slicing open his shoulder. And again, the icy effect on Äs Nödt's open wound is really nice. There's something just so visually appealing about it. The ground beneath Rukia's feet also begins to freeze as well, causing the earth around them to quake and shudder. Clearly realising he's in trouble now, Äs Nödt pounces towards Rukia, though I'm not entirely sure what his plan was here, but that being said, this is what he does in the original chapter as well. Perhaps he hoped to simply kill her with his bare hands before she became too cold, though I think it was probably already too late for that. However, as he darts towards her, Rukia swings her blade around herself as her body temperature reaches absolute zero. This sequence is again handled really well, and we're treated to some very inventive shots, some very inventive angles, which I absolutely love. For example, the camera pans in close on Rukia, on her eye, moving through her eye like a pane of glass, before showing Äs Nödt as though he appears in her eye before he's struck down. It's all really quite cinematic. Äs Nödt closes in on Rukia, but with a swift strike, we see him instantly frozen over, the Shinigami landing behind him on the rooftop as chapter 567 ends. Now, as we reach roughly the halfway point of the episode, that also means we've reached the halfway point of the core itself, which is crazy to think about. But as we end the chapter, that awesome shot of Rukia is unfortunately cut, as well as Äs Nödt's final thoughts as he's frozen over too. Chapter 568 begins, and Rukia starts to thaw herself out, musing on how troublesome her newfound power actually is. As her thumb splits open, she realises she exceeded her time limit while absolute zero. Now, I was kind of wondering how they were going to portray this next scene. In the original chapter, Rukia just sort of realises that something is wrong, but it's never explicitly said how. I always thought Äs Nödt started to shake and she heard the ice cracking, but here it's handled in a very effective way. There's suddenly a terrifying flash as a twisted, horrific image of Äs Nödt's holy form appears on screen, and Rukia presumably senses his Reiatsu in that moment. As the frozen Äs Nödt wonders if this is what fear is, something very cool happens. We get his flashback. I was concerned going into the episode that his flashback might have been cut, but thankfully it's here, and it's almost completely intact. In fact, it's been moved up from where it was in the source material, and I actually think this works very well. It is a Bleach trope to see the villain's history just as they're about to die, which is what happens with Äs Nödt in the source material, but here I think it makes a lot of sense to have Äs Nödt reflect on his life and his own fear in this moment, and have that be the driver that pushes him to keep fighting, even if it tears his body apart. In his flashback, we see Äs Nödt as a bedridden human in a fairly modern hospital. This state of existence of his was hinted at last week with his poem, suspended between living and being allowed to live, between dying and being killed, and according to him, it's complete agony. Although Äs Nödt wonders about heaven and hell, the shot of the German Bible on his hospital bedside table is removed, which again is a bit disappointing. It's fantastic imagery, however, that even before he was a Sternritter, his face was still covered by a mask of some kind, except this one was helping him breathe, helping him live. And the timeline is definitely interesting here too. Äs Nödt is clearly one of the newer recruits into the army, being picked up by Yhwach after his reawakening in the present day. Yhwach's arrival into the hospital room is slightly changed here. We see him standing immediately beside Äs's bed, whereas in the original he actually walks into the room. Yhwach mentions that Äs is the sole survivor of something, but what that catastrophe is, we're not sure. It's cool too seeing the F Schrift materialising out of Yhwach's blood. It is really awesome to take a step back from this moment and realise how big of a deal this must have been that Äs was approached in a one-on-one basis by Yhwach himself, actually acknowledged by the King of the Quincy. Now, presumably Äs Nödt was a Quincy at this point. If he was just a random human, then it's interesting that Yhwach chose him. Presumably he could see that void in Äs's soul. He could see that great trembling fear emblazoned as a word upon Äs's own soul and decided, you know what, that's a guy I can use in my army. Äs Nödt then begins to free himself from RUKIA'S ice, cracking and shattering the surface layer of cold as he realises the only thing he fears is Yhwach's wrath. Interestingly, when we see Yhwach's eyes, it's just a panel taken straight from the original chapter. However, the depiction of Äs Nödt freeing himself is quite different from the source material. Äs Nödt rips himself out of the ice, screaming in pain as he breaks free of RUKIA'S power. In the anime, when the ice falls away from his face, it looks like almost all of his skin has been pulled off, leaving his face a bloodied, fleshy mess. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily look like there's anything inherently wrong with his mouth. In the source material, Äs Nödt breaking free of the ice destroys his mask and slightly damages his skin, but he then turns and screams at RUKIA, revealing his mouth has no lips. Now, I always assumed that this was how he actually looked under the mask, not that breaking himself free of the ice then tore off his lips. So it's kind of interesting that the anime chose to make it gorier, while also seemingly removing Äs's original ailment. Of course, immense praise needs to be slathered upon the anime here, though Äs Nödt freeing himself not only looks amazing, it sounds incredible too, as his voice actor delivers a powerhouse performance, the likes of which we haven't really yet seen on the show. Äs Nödt shrieks in this horrible, guttural voice that's genuinely uncomfortably jarring to listen to, and I think it's brilliantly effective. His eye fully rolls back, revealing his Quincy cross as blood gushes from its socket. In that moment, he activates his Vollständig in a pillar of purple light. Äs Nödt's transformation happens instantly in the chapter, so I'm very pleased to see it extended here. Those familiar church bells ring as we witness what happens inside the column of energy. As his body undergoes a horrific transformation, something bursts out of his chest cavity before it's stuffed back inside and sewn up again to his throat. I thought it was originally his organs, but it may actually be the massive bulbous head that we know is hiding inside him in preparation for his second form. His body then lurches over as his purple halo spins into life on his head. As RUKIA looks on, her eyes widen in horror, the pillar shatters, revealing Äs Nödt's holy form, Tartar Foras, with the anime managing to capture Kubo's own artwork very well here. Now, it's always been a little bit jarring how much effort was clearly put into Äs Nödt's holy form in comparison to most others. It gets a name, it gets a complete transformation, whereas others before it like Bambietta and even Masked Masculine don't really get anything like that. While it's clearly just because Kubo loved Äs Nödt's design and felt there was a lot he could do with his theme, I've always tried to think of an in-universe explanation for the difference in these forms. And the best I could come up with was it's a mixture of how powerful the Sternritter is and how loyal to Yhwach they are, but even then I'm not sure it really makes sense. As we enter the next phase of the battle, this opening section is changed up ever so slightly. In the original chapter, upon seeing his new form, Rukia leaps away from Äs Nödt only for him to land behind her somehow. Here he simply drops down from the sky and lands in front of her. As Rukia launches a flurry of attacks, she realises she's unable to hit Äs Nödt. I think this is also portrayed slightly differently between the two mediums. In the original chapter, I always interpreted this scene as Rukia swinging wildly without realising that she was rooted to the spot. Fear had already begun to affect her, and as a result she was paralysed in place. Äs Nödt himself doesn't move at all during this initial sequence, or so I thought. Here in the anime though, he definitely seems to be dodging out of the way, but the implication is that Rukia is getting cold feet and pulling back each time she gets near him. As Rukia wonders what's going on, Äs Nödt reveals that in his holy form she needs to only lay eyes upon him for his fear to work. I remember there being some consternation back in the day over the fact that surely if Rukia's cells were all frozen to the point of death, her nerves would be too, but then she can still see, so it feels like a magical loophole that Kubo was using. As Rukia succumbs to the fear, the sound suddenly goes out, and she finds herself enclosed within an enormous dome. Again, this scene is handled very faithfully. Hundreds upon hundreds of Äs Nödt's eyes open throughout the dome, surrounding Rukia on all sides. She attempts to close her eyes, but he tells her it won't do a thing, explaining that just as past fears arise in the dark of night, fears will resonate even stronger in the depths of her brain with her eyes shut, essentially meaning there's absolutely no escape from this power. We then see a vision of Ichigo, Orihime, and Byakuya as Rukia experiences her own version of the fear, much like her brother before her, with all three of them rotting and decaying in a truly gruesome fashion, their skulls collapsing in on themselves as flies pour out of every orifice. I have both praise for this scene and take slight issue with it as well. Firstly, it's very weird that Renji isn't in this shot. I think the reason he isn't is because this scene is being adapted from this panel in the original chapter, which shows Rukia experiencing a number of memories that have been twisted and distorted by Äs Nödt's power, and simply Renji doesn't feature in any of them, which is in itself very odd. The anime could have and probably should have added him in. Secondly, I appreciate getting the chance to see the fear in action again in a way we didn't in the original chapter, and it's always awesome to bring back this terrifying imagery, but the fact it plays out in the exact same fashion as Byakuya's is a little bit strange, and if anything, it limits the scope of what Äs Nödt can achieve. Do all of his victims just see their loved ones decay and feel themselves covered in flies? What I liked about Rukia's fear in the source material was that it felt specific to her. Fear can obviously take on many different forms, as noted by Äs Nödt in his monologue, so it was cool to see many of her cherished thoughts and memories being distorted. Plus, the visual of seeing old panels reworked to have black eyes was really creepy, giving the idea that the people she loves and cares about have somehow been changed and become almost alien and snatched away from her. That idea of abandonment being central to Rukia's fears. Either way, it's still a great visual in the anime, and with Äs Nödt declaring that he will now burn away her soul using her past fears, it seems like the fight is lost. Rukia succumbs to the fear and screams, unleashing a horrible blood-curdling howl, another amazing acting performance by the way, when suddenly a bright pink light severs the dome surrounding her, splitting Äs's power apart and freeing Rukia from his grasp. As we reach the end of chapter 568, Byakuya Kuchiki arrives in a whirlwind of sakura petals. As the rest of Äs Nödt's dome of eyes disintegrates, Byakuya's arrival plays out exactly the same again as the source material, with Äs Nödt mocking him, snickering that he's lost some weight after their last battle, and presumably had trouble keeping food down after his injury. Again, the fact they kept all of this in is a testament to how much better the pacing manages to feel this week. When Rukia suddenly remembers that Äs Nödt wanted to face her brother all along, she tries to warn Byakuya, but Äs quickly regroups his eyes, preparing to surround the captain. As thousands of eyes gather in the sky, however, a single petal falls past Byakuya's face before he obliterates them all with Senbon Zakura. This scene looks awesome, with the glow of Senbon Zakura instantly shredding the eyes, their gooey remains dripping from the sky above. The anime continues to play up Äs Nödt's insanity in an almost cartoonish way, his eyes bulging as he notes he wishes he could have kept hold of Byakuya's Bankai. I do wonder what actually happened to Äs Nödt to turn him from the sickly but otherwise fairly normal looking individual on the hospital bed to this absolutely twisted and maniacal fiend. Was it the corrupting power of his Schrift? However, Byakuya reveals that he's not using Bankai. Instead, he's only using his Shikai, indirectly revealing just how powerful he's become. He thanks Äs Nödt for enabling him to reassess his relationship with his Zanpakuto, causing the Sternritter to lose his mind. Again, as you've seen so far, this fight has been incredibly faithful to the source material, maybe one of, if not the most faithful to date in the anime. As the Sternritter then begins to transform into a Bloodborne boss, again with some truly tremendous visuals, including a massive bulbous eye popping out of his own chest, Byakuya approaches Rukia. Now, of course, much has been said about Byakuya's involvement in this arc, and it's true that unless some big changes are made down the line, he really won't have a lot to do after this point. However, this is a great moment in and of itself. Byakuya acknowledges Rukia's strength, completing the development of their bond and their relationship, a relationship that until now has been mostly characterized by distance more than anything else. Byakuya has always kept Rukia at arm's length, in some ways callously disregarding her feelings, but also because he's always felt a need to keep her safe. As we've seen in the past, Byakuya has had to rescue Rukia, saving her from Zamari because to him, she's always been something that needs protecting. It's his duty to keep her safe. Perhaps the role of an older brother, yes, but also out of devotion to his late wife Hisana and the promise he made to her. But this moment is Rukia truly coming of age and growing up and out of his shadow once and for all. After sensing how powerful she's really become, Byakuya helps her out one last time. He frees her from Äs Nödt's control and helps her to reaffirm that she no longer feels afraid before stepping back, both literally and figuratively. Ever since the day she was made an unseated officer, Rukia has always sought out Byakuya's respect and worked hard to attain it, while he's held her back out of fear of losing her. This is a moment of understanding and of letting go, where Byakuya realises he no longer needs to be her protector and she no longer needs protecting. Yes, Äs Nödt was about to win that fight. Rukia isn't perfect after all, and she still does have a way to go, but she's capable now of going toe-to-toe and even killing the same man who tormented Byakuya himself. Where Byakuya failed, Rukia is able to stand tall in the end. Byakuya tells Rukia that fear arises from the insecurities in one's heart, before asking if she has any more fears left of her own, and Rukia defiantly replies, no. As we approach the end of chapter 569 and the climax of the fight itself, the ending song begins to play. Äs Nödt's grotesque new form is revealed as he tells Byakuya the end is upon them. Now, there is some debate over whether or not the ending song, the end credits soundtrack, takes away from this moment or not. While I appreciate their dedication to the fight itself and not wanting to end the episode before Rukia activates her Bankai, they're clearly trying to get as much mileage out of the episode as they can, I'll admit I don't think the song is totally fitting. Now, is that just because I was really hoping that they would play Nightmare during this sequence after years of speculating and hoping that they would? Perhaps. But I do think this is a more somber and powerful moment than the soundtrack really allows for. That being said, I still think the finale of this battle works extraordinarily well. Plus, like with episode 13 before it, there's something special about the ending playing over the scene as though it's being lifted higher than the rest. Byakuya steps away, revealing that he won't be the one to end the fight. Äs Nödt takes this as another insult, and in doing so he reveals that he's never really seen Rukia as a serious opponent up until now, and that's about to cost him in the biggest way possible. As Rukia readies her blade, Byakuya reminds her that she doesn't see her own fear reflected upon Äs Nödt's twisted face. For if there is no fear left in her heart, then all that's possibly standing in front of her is Äs's own terror, displayed for all to see. Although the song keeps playing in the background, the credits themselves do disappear to allow for Rukia to release her Bankai. In an explosive torrent of icy power, a plume of snow blasts into the sky before an avalanche of diamond-white cold waves rush down the alleyway, engulfing Äs Nödt entirely. You can briefly see as well that in this form he now actually has 4 wings, which is a cool detail. It's also a little clearer what her Bankai actually does here in the anime. She simply points her sword forwards and a wave of energy barrels towards her opponent. I'll be honest, I always used to think she swung her sword, hence why the top half of Äs Nödt's head is missing as though it's been cut off. But alas. The actual activation of her Bankai looks incredible. The feeling of pure power is palpable, and as we begin chapter 570, we're treated to more of Äs Nödt's backstory, this time appearing in the same place it did originally. In a sense, Äs's death for such a monstrous character is a tragic one, as he feels nothing but fear before he dies, and we see his Schrift crumble into pieces. As the Sternritter's enormous form collapses into a frozen rubble, something is visible through the icy mist. Interestingly, Rukia's blade doesn't look as transparent as it does in the chapter, however her Bankai looks genuinely breathtaking. It's astounding how well they were able to translate it into the anime. As the camera pans up, her outfit is revealed in all of its glory. Hakka no Togame transforms Rukia into a true queen of the icy elements, bestowing her with a flowing, sparkling robe, the ribbon of Sode no Shirayuki now like looping wings upon her back. The outfit itself is adorned with ornate collars, a flowery centerpiece, and a glittery crown of icicles. Rukia's hair and eyes turn a pale, shimmering lilac, but what I like best of all is the way the anime turns Rukia into an ice sculpture herself. In the original chapter, it looked like she was wearing normal, albeit ceremonial, clothing. But here the anime has added a truly stunning effect that makes Rukia look as though she's completely made of a glassy, reflective ice herself. Her collar is transparent, and her sleeves gleam in the light. One of the best, if not the best looking Bankai in Bleach has truly been done justice here. Even better, the end credits track has long since finished. In its place is a simple silence. Then, as Rukia herself comes into view, she, like Renji before her, is afforded a new vocal track. This time, I believe, a remix of Never Meant to Belong, one of the most melancholy and iconic of Bleach's original songs. As Rukia begins to disengage her Bankai, her hand splits open, fracturing like porcelain. However, as her hand fractures, Byakuya takes it in his own, his fingers freezing over as he tells her to slowly release the Bankai. In another moment of pride, Byakuya compliments her Bankai, calling it wonderful, but at the same time leaves her with a parting warning. It's a dangerous Bankai, and a single misstep with it could cost Rukia her life. As he turns to leave, Rukia's hair slowly fading back to black once more, Byakuya tells her that a sword swung in exchange for one's life can't be used to protect anything. This is again a powerful moment as Byakuya seemingly passes the role of protector onto Rukia herself. It's also hard not to think of Komamura in this moment. He swung his sword in exchange for his life, and while he technically did successfully protect Shinji Hinamori and other officers, he won't be capable of defending anyone ever again, it seems like. Byakuya tells Rukia that they must go and protect the Soul Society as the episode's title finally appears. Now that's where I predicted the episode would end last week, however we're not done, as the episode then carries on with what I guess would technically be the post-credit scene featuring the latter quarter of chapter 570. Isane, who has now moved into the underground bunker that we find her in the source material, is currently trying to heal Rose and Kensei. Presumably the other members of the 4th Division she was with earlier all regrouped as per Kyoraku's call at some point, but it's hard to say for sure. It kind of seems like now that that call was to get the officers out of the vicinity so that we know characters like Rukia didn't just kill a bunch of them with her Bankai. Anyway, it's revealed that Isane has teamed up with Yachiru to try and continue building out their makeshift infirmary, and I love the spooky green lighting in here. But they're suddenly discovered by a mysterious Quincy enemy who grapples Isane before being punched by Yachiru. However, as the vice captain quickly forgets who or what he is, he viciously attacks her before seemingly disappearing from both of their perception entirely. Of course, this is none other than Gwenael Lee, who I'm kind of surprised to see here. I thought his character might have been cut from the anime entirely after he wasn't present on the cast list, but here he is. Now, this video has been going on for ages at this point, so I'll wrap things up here. There isn't too much to talk about regarding this ending anyway, outside of it setting up the calamitous battle to come next week. Meanwhile, the poem this week comes courtesy of Sternritter V, Gremmy Thamo, featuring his brain. I really hope we get more insight into that next week, by the way, even though I'm not hugely optimistic about it. The poem reads, "Beauty means that there is nothing there," which is essentially the same as his poem from volume 64, and to me this poem reflects Gremmy's powers of imagination and how vapid someone with that ability might view the world to be. Gremmy is able to create beautiful things out of nothingness, but does that mean they're truly beautiful? If they're born of nothing and return to nothing upon his desire or death, then what are they in actuality if nothing themselves? And of course, next week, episode 20, is called I Am the Edge. Okay, before we move on to our predictions, which won't take too long I imagine, it's time of course for Sternritter in Memoriam, and this week we're committing a huge 3 Sternritter to the Memoriam at once. It's a sad day for me, as these 3 characters are all some of my favourite Sternritter, especially Äs Nödt, but both BG9 and Kangdu have fantastic designs, and both of them felt underutilised in the end. So the first to die this week was Sternritter I the Iron Kangdu, who was quickly followed by Sternritter K BG9, both of whom were executed in a truly brutal fashion, after their fates were fairly long overdue. But of course the biggest casualty this week is Sternritter F the Fear Äs Nödt, the last of the Bankai stealing Sternritter to fall, and in my opinion easily the best and most impactful. Äs Nödt was my favourite Quincy for a long time, and it was sad to see him go, but I'm grateful his battle was given the weight and justice it deserved. Our memorial wall is filling up fast, and I don't foresee it slowing down anytime soon really either. This core is a total bloodbath. As for the predictions this week, well, truth be told, there isn't a lot to say. The entire episode next week will feature the battle between Kenpachi and Gremmy in what may well be the biggest fight of the core. It's sure to be a massive explosive spectacle, and I wonder if we'll get the same kind of treatment as Yamamoto versus Royd. Personally, if only one fight this core can truly look that good, then I'd rather they saved it for Ichigo versus Yhwach, but I guess we'll have to see. Maybe both of them will look that good in an ideal world. Now, I originally speculated a while back that this fight would be split across 2 episodes, but I'm hearing talk that next week will adapt the entire thing in one go, plus Yachiru versus Gwenael at the start, meaning roughly 9 chapters in total. That sounds admittedly terrifying from a pacing perspective, but I'm also ready to reserve judgment. Don't forget, last week they covered 7 pages of fighting material in 60 seconds when it came to Kensei versus Mask. Many of the chapters focusing on Kenpachi versus Gremmy are extremely light on dialogue and heavy on battle sequences, and I imagine they could blast through them in virtually no time at all. That's not to say there won't be cuts though. I imagine Gwenael's scene early on in the episode will be chopped down in favour of spotlighting Gremmy's fight, which I don't think anyone will really mind. Just as long as Askin's scene from chapter 575 is there, I'll be happy. Anyway, that's it for the episode. This has been a pretty exhaustive look, but I hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as I did making it. These review videos always take the longest amount of time to create, so I appreciate everyone's patience as always. Now that both Rukia vs Äs Nödt and Renji vs Mask Demasculine are behind us, it's clear to me at least that Rukia's fight was given far more prominence and care overall, which I'm personally fine with. That's not to say Renji's was bad, it's just so ruthlessly quick. But I was very happy this week and watched the entire episode with a huge grin on my face. Visually, both Äs Nödt and Rukia were a feast for the eyes, and the fight will absolutely go down as a high point of the core. Now though, expectations are likely sky high for next week's showdown, so can the anime pull it off once again? That's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below, what did you think of all of this episode in its entirety, of Ichigo's scene, of the Sternritter Execution scene, and of course of Rukia versus Äs Nödt, and then that cliffhanger that's probably leading us in to the biggest fight of the core to date, certainly to date, but maybe of the entire set of 13 episodes. We'll have to wait and see. I really hope you enjoyed the video though, guys. Make sure to leave a like if you did, hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.